Our scripture reading this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, verses 14 through 21. And then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee. And a report about him spread throughout all of the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on them, and then he began to say to them, Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." May God bless the reading of the gospel. For the artist, Norman Rockwell, homecoming was a popular theme. In a print from 1945 titled "Marine Homecoming," a uniformed son captivates an audience of men and boys in a messy garage. Seated on crates, they all lean in, gazing intently at the hometown boy, a blue star tacked on the wall behind them, reminding us how he had been remembered while he was away. The word homecoming appears frequently in the titles of Rockwell's works. Boy Scout Homecoming shows a child dragging a bulging duffel bag as he comes down the hallway. Christmas Homecoming depicts a father with his suitcase in hand, embraced by a loving wife with adoring children gazing on at each side of them. Another print with the same title shows a couple moving across snowy landscape with a pile of packages in a sleigh on the woman's lap. Rockwell's scenes evoke nostalgia for strong communities and loving family bonds. The iconic Thanksgiving cover from the Saturday Evening Post, displaying a large turkey platter surrounded by grateful diners, real enough to stir feelings in the coldest heart of homesickness. We can almost smell the freshly baked pies and taste Grandma's special stuffing recipe. Judging by the faces that are portrayed in Rockwell's scenes of American life, it would be easy to conclude that Rockwell must have lived a charming existence, a home that was always a positive place for him. Biographies of him tell a different tale. Decades of battling depression, 3 rocky marriages, trouble with the kids, economic ups and downs. Life wasn't one long pastel parade of delightfulness for this famous artist. And still, Rockwell's vision of this American life, perhaps more aspirational than descriptive, inspires longing for a simpler, kinder, gentler home to which we could all return someday. When Jesus of Nazareth returned to his hometown after his time away in the wilderness, he was surrounded by men and boys whom he had known in his youth. They went to the man place, not the garage, but a synagogue. As a boy, he would have been like the youngsters in Rockwell's painting, leaning in to learn something from the man with experience. Now he returns as one around whom others will gather to listen and learn. In the practice of his family and his hometown faith, a respected man of experience takes the scroll for the day and reads the selected scripture passage. And then he sits down in the common manner of teaching, and the others gather about, listening as the teacher expounds on the sacred text. Do you remember when later in Luke's gospel, Jesus friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, are entertaining their friend in their own home. Do you remember how Martha got upset with her sister Mary because she wasn't helping out in the kitchen? Mary was, Luke says, in the other room, sitting at Jesus' feet while he was teaching the disciples. She had pulled up her crate like any eager student, any faithful disciple, so that she could listen and learn as the teacher was expounding on the meaning of Scripture. He applauded Mary for choosing the better portion, for choosing to listen and to learn at his feet. In today's story, in Luke, there are no female disciples present. We're in the synagogue, where only men can gather at that time. Rockwell could have painted it much like that scene in the garage of the Marines' homecoming. All the guys around the hometown boy come back. The little boys and the teenagers, the old men, his father's friends. Luke says Jesus received a hero's reception. His neighbors amazed by his words. Everybody had good things to say about him. Now, for those of us who are familiar with this passage, we may be distracted by what we know is going to happen next. Well, that part of the story is for next week's sermon. Many study Bibles will put a little descriptor right above the verses that we just read, saying the rejection of Jesus in Nazareth, which is premature. No rejection today. Today, Jesus is Nazareth's favorite son, which is something to be told. Today, they're so impressed, they say things like, wow, is this really Joseph and Mary's kid? He's risen above the expectations of all who knew him. For most of us, a sure sign of homecoming success. The climax comes when he takes his seat after reading the scroll, signaling he is today's teacher and he is ready to share something. And as he does, surely homecomings familiar to them from Scripture spring to mind, informing their expectations of this sermon. One such homecoming story would have been that one about Nehemiah, the prophet, and the scribe Ezra. After years of exile in Babylon, Nehemiah came home to Jerusalem and organized urban renewal projects. The city was devastated and the countryside a wasteland, following a brutal war and the complete destruction of their holy temple. Together with Ezra, Nehemiah set about restoring the city walls and rebuilding the temple. The situation was bleak. The Persians still taxed them heavily. They were threatened on all sides by their enemies. Far from a homecoming success story, their return to the land of their ancestors had been a disappointing exercise, and most of the company despaired for the future of their children. In the midst of this wretched homecoming, Ezra was asked to go and fetch the scroll of Moses, the Torah. As was the ancient custom, he read to them from the scroll and then went about teaching and interpreting it. The reading and teaching went on for hours. Ezra patiently translating the Hebrew, which they no longer understood, into the languages they all now spoke. He appointed several priests to walk up and down among the people as they sat there and answered their questions, explaining things to them as they went along. After their years away from home, they were no longer a biblically literate people. A long Bible study sit-in became a transformative moment for a newly reforming nation. The hundreds of years which had elapsed between the experiences of Moses, which they heard Ezra reading about, how Moses brought the Hebrew people home to this land, sounded relevant and strangely familiar. They resonated to a story of liberation, the promise of a new home. As lamps were lit and darkness fell, the distance flew away. They found themselves no longer spectators of, but participants in the story of God. They perceived themselves as those who had wandered in the wilderness, the covenant they had with God lost to them and forgotten. A sense of loss and shame brought tears to their eyes as they grieved over what they had neglected in all those decades lost in exile. Ezra responded to the company's despondency, saying, "Don't grieve about this, don't cry. This is a day of remembering who we are and who God is. So go home, prepare a feast, and share it with those who don't have anything, because this day is holy to God, and the joy of the Lord is your strength." A Marine homecoming in 1945 was, of course, complicated, not just a picture for a postcard. Grief and relief, sadness and rejoicing, survivor's guilt and giddy happiness, all of these feelings overlapping. In Rockwell's print, each facial expression on the different men and boys is poignant. The red-headed young Marine has deep creases in his forehead, and his jaw is set so somberly. What must he have felt as all his old pals gathered around him in that garage? He was no longer the boy that had left them years before. And in many ways, their town was no longer the home that he had so fondly remembered while he was across the ocean. I wonder how Jesus felt when he came back and was gathered around with the men and boys of Nazareth, who spoke so highly of him and eagerly leaned in to hear what he would say in the synagogue that day. He too was changed by his 40 days in the wilderness, his experience of meeting and calling his disciples, his awareness of the cost of truthful preaching, which would soon be exacted from his cousin John, the baptizer. How truthful was he willing to be in bringing to his hometown God's transformative word? All of us longing for a homecoming to match our dreaming of it, for the returning son or daughter longing to be known and respected at home for the persons we have become and are still becoming. After we've left home, the person who comes back is different from the one who left. You can see it in the young Marine's face. I can sense it in the voices of Nehemiah and Ezra leaping from the pages of the books in Scripture that bear their names. I can hear it in the stirring reading from Isaiah's scroll, which Jesus presents to his hometown synagogue. None of them can conform themselves to the expectations of their listeners. All must find a new place within the old community while holding fast to the truth of who God is calling them to become. When Jesus is handed that scroll, he finds the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." The homecoming promise for all returning exiles is that God will make God's home with us, and by God's power will call us into the work of bringing good news to the poor and captive, blind and oppressed. And if we are as wise as Mary and those guys in the garage leaning in to listen, then as our lamps are lit and darkness falls, the distance between us and the Scripture will finally fall away. We'll find ourselves not spectators of an ancient story, but participants in the story today, which God is writing. And when we do, we will finally realize the blessed promise of coming home is to the city of God, which we partner in building through Christ our Lord. Amen.